people who suffer so much or try to flee the resultant chaos and violence. What peace and justice activists need to advocate for consistently is that nations such as those in Europe and the USA must articulate and then implement a foreign policy which promotes stability, security, and development in the countries where the refugee crisis originates. Part of this involves respecting the right of all nations to self-determination and sovereignty, not intervening militarily as a first option when, for example, there may be human rights violations in certain countries, not seeking a regime change as if this is the only solution, but rather seeking the way of peace and justice through non-violent strategies and working in collaborative partnerships with all the stakeholders to ensure political and social stability and economic and social development. But in crisis situations, political leadership in potential receiving countries has to do everything possible to rescue and care for those who face the threat of losing their lives or the misery of surviving in transit areas or camps. Therefore, the focus for me this evening, the concern for me, is the immediacy of the humanitarian crisis faced by thousands of refugees striving to get into Europe and elsewhere. But by extension, NGOs, non-governmental organizations, communities, and people in Europe need to face the same question in a personal way as our European lawyers in Lesvos have done. Is there a moral obligation on all to welcome and care for refugees? For me, this obligation is rooted in the concept of the fundamental dignity of every human being. All people, whatever their worldview or whatever motivates their choices or decisions, whether it be spiritual values or basic human values on which most people could agree. Most, if not all people, should sense some resonance at hearing the term human dignity. If we were asked, what is human dignity? We would all probably give some various answers based on experiences of what we would feel if our dignity was infringed, or if our dignity and human rights were not respected. For example, in my country, South Africa, the black oppressed people had their dignity as a human being profoundly crushed by the apartheid system, which we are still trying to heal and transform. And it is surely the same for the millions of refugees whose many forms of suffering and rejection are a direct assault on their dignity. In reality, any attack on human dignity, anything which takes away in some way the dignity of a human being, is a form of violence. The Constitutional Court in South Africa has referred to dignity as a notoriously difficult concept. It needs precision and elaboration. In one of its many judgments over the past years, this court stated, "We in South Africa are emerging from a period in our history during which the humanity of the majority of our inhabitants of this country was denied. They were treated as not having inherent worth, as objects whose identities could be arbitrarily defined by those in power, rather than as persons of infinite worth. In short, they were denied recognition of their inherent dignity. So firstly, the concept of human dignity seems to be fairly new in international and domestic constitutional law. Dignity is protected as a value or a right, or both, in international law and in the way law is interpreted in different countries. But human dignity as a concept or value was not defined in the first international document which recognized human dignity as something inherent in us, as something essential to us as a human being, and that it has to therefore be protected. And that was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1946 at the United Nations. And many international and national documents followed on this. However, after World War II, as far as constitutional law judgments are concerned in different countries, dignity seems to comprise three elements or aspects. Firstly, that every human being has equal inherent human dignity that cannot be set aside or diminished by anyone or any institution. Secondly, that if human dignity is inherent to the individual person, it has to be affirmed and respected. And thirdly, as a result of this call for recognition and respect, states have an obligation to progressively realize human dignity through the protection of human rights, particularly through the implementation of socio-economic rights for the individual, like the basic rights to housing, education, healthcare, and so forth, so often lacking in the reality faced by refugees struggling to find a home in Europe and elsewhere, the USA, Africa, and indeed anywhere in the world. So the preamble to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1946, and for example, Article 1, Paragraph 1 of German Basic Law, and Section 10 of the Constitution of South Africa, 1996, expressed those three elements I have referred to, and can therefore be used as a sort of basic definition of human dignity. The preamble to the Universal Declaration, specifically the first and fifth paragraph, states, whereas recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. And whereas the peoples of the United Nations have in the Charter reaffirmed their faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, and in the equal rights of men and women, and are determined to promote social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom. The preamble. So the first principle guiding any discussion in this is every human being has inherent human dignity and worth. In other words, the worth of a person has no price, admits of no substitute, cannot be traded off for anything in the world. In addition, human dignity has no nationality. It is inherent in all people, citizens and non-citizens alike, simply because they are human. The second element, the issue of human rights based on human dignity. The UN General Assembly determined in 1986 that new human rights instruments should derive from the inherent dignity and worth of the human person. Consequently, inherent dignity was enacted in the major conventions on the rights of children in 1989, the rights of migrant workers in 1990, the protection against forced disappearance and the rights of disabled persons in 2007, and so forth. In 1993, delegates from 170 countries who convened at the Vienna Second World Conference chose inherent dignity as central to the protection and development of human rights. Now, even though we may affirm the inherent dignity in every person, we also have to recognize and accept that there is diversity in any given society. There are differences in human beings, and especially in cultures. The social, political, and cultural context in any country, therefore, can contribute to a broader understanding of human dignity and human rights, and what it requires of all governments, institutions of state like the courts, communities, and people. So the goal of achieving equal or at least adequate human dignity for all people will only happen if minimum living conditions are provided, namely the provision of socio-economic rights as far as these can be done with the resources available in the country, which is of course a major challenge for developing nations in particular. Justice Chaskalson of the South African Constitutional Court explained that socio-economic rights are rooted in respect for human dignity. For how can there be dignity in a life lived without access to housing, healthcare, food, water, or in the case of people unable to look after themselves without appropriate assistance? That is a succinct description of what so many refugees experience, which deprives them of the minimum conditions of life so that they can live in dignity and develop their human potential. Therefore, I submit this evening that in addition to caring for its own citizens, welcoming and caring for refugees is indeed a moral imperative for state and non-state actors alike. So with these reflections, my dear friends, I congratulate and affirm European lawyers in Lesvos for the inspiration they have given to all of us in Pax Christi International and elsewhere, and above all, for their commitment to upholding the rule of law, the protection of human rights, and meaningful access to justice for refugees on Lesvos. Thank you.